So, taking us from what was a crazy upset to a national upset that you and I called, and I think we called this one about a month ago, and that's Washington Southern Cal. Southern Cal, yes, is playing better behind Sam Darnold, and he had a great night again Saturday, and I think he does bring an element with his feet that was a liability with Max Brown because they don't have a great offensive line. But that being said, we also saw what you and I have talked about for a couple of weeks, even though we've been high on Washington and we've liked, and most of that is because of quarterback play. We've also noted that they opened the season with 7 straight unranked, and all until Stanford won the weekend after the first rankings for the playoff committee came out. They were all 500 or worse. So really bad teams. Struggle with Utah. I think they beat them the last 2 or 3 minutes of the game. They went up on them. So this is really the first team that they've played that was physical and that was deep in terms of talent and could match them a little bit on both sides of the ball. So while I didn't think I thought Southern Cal would win, the score and the way they dominated Washington isn't reflected on the scoreboard and really kind of surprised me. Were you surprised, or did this game play out the way you thought it would?
This game played out exactly the way I thought it would. Yeah, I mean, it's everything you said, plus one, right? I mean, it just, USC is so much more talented than everybody else in the Pac-12. I know Washington has some young talent. They're developing. But both of us saw the same thing. Washington had not played any strong teams. There are very few teams in the Pac-12 that can run the ball with any semblance of power, frankly. And when they did play those teams, at times they started really giving up the run. And conversely, Washington had been very, very good offensively, but we both had real question marks about the size and strength of their entire offense. It's a very good finesse offense, but Chris Peterson likes to have a balanced, powerful attack. And I think he will build that at Washington. He just doesn't have the horses right now. And for that style of football that he wants to run, which has been very effective, where he's trying to big boy at times the other team, keep balance, throw the ball, that works until you play a team like USC that is just a hell of a lot bigger and stronger than you are.
Yeah, and I think I even mentioned this to you during the game, and I've seen Washington play, I believe, all but 1 or 2 of their games this year I've seen. And it's never really registered with me like it did watching them play Southern Cal, just how small Washington is, and not in the way like Oregon used to field small teams, like small, fast space player teams that still could dominate because in their front 7 they were either super athletic or that's where they found some size. And for Washington, they're neither large nor athletic, and Southern Cal has that in buckets. And everybody's going to say, well, Southern Cal hasn't gotten that much better since 52-6, and I don't think they have. But like we talk, and like you've talked in the past a whole lot, using the Auburn-Arkansas example of how just a little bit here and there in terms of having a physical advantage, 4 yards instead of 3, that sort of thing in space creates all the difference in the world. Well, they finally played a team that's got those little bits of advantage, and they were able to just really overpower them.
Yeah, the whole point there, right, is if you're going to get your speedy players on the edge, you're going to try to create these space mismatches. If you have a 3-yard gap when your guy catches the ball because of the speed of the defense and their reaction time, the play runs a certain way, right? You get by the first linebacker, and the safety is the guy that's going to have the angle. When you play another team that when you catch the ball gives you a yard and a half or 2 yards because the outside linebacker is just faster and better, now you're making the play against the linebacker, and that changes what would be a 12-yard play into a 4 or 5-yard play. And now you have to sustain drives by completing that 4 or 5-yard play 3 times in a row, where before you only had to hit it once or two, once out of every 2 or 3 times, and you get a first down each time. And note, I'm not really talking about like the comparative strength even sometimes of the players, right? It's not about the receiver and his speed so much against the linebacker. It certainly comes into play, but a lot of it is just when you run the play, it takes X amount of time to get the ball to the receiver on a bubble screen. And the faster the defense, the less space you have once he catches it. And that's why, and you hear me say this a lot, those types of offenses don't work in the NFL because when you run those plays and the talent level gets NFL level, they are on top of you once you catch the ball. So you need to be, throwing the ball downfield so that you have a first down when the moment you've caught it. And you have to generate space through schematics versus what a lot of these teams do, particularly in the Pac 12 where the defenses really are weaker. They're not trying to generate space and plays and yards through schematic issues with the offense, which is what a pro style offense does. They're just purely trying to get the ball to a player out in space somewhere and let him make a play. And what Washington ran into is, that may work good and well when you play teams that don't play good defense, even if you don't really, have all that many athletes on offense sometimes. But when you play a team that does have a good defense, that style of offense can be shut down just utterly.
And I think this showed up in two places that Washington has really relied on this year to be able to not only win, but win with huge margins. And that's being able to run the ball. Gaskin was 15 carries for 51 yards. He was really ineffective. And Browning, for all of his ability, which I still think you put him on any team with an offensive line, and he is just Murderville. But in this game, he really struggled, and not just the two interceptions, but building any kind of consistency because his offensive line was overpowered throughout most of the game. And I don't think he's been used to not having the time and having his internal clock sped up like that, which threw everything out of whack.
Right. I mean, both teams threw two interceptions in this ball game, right? I mean, it wasn't clean for either side. Sam Darnold wasn't necessarily superior in a lot of ways. The difference was Sam Darnold had at least some time to throw the ball.
And he could move his feet and bail in the pocket when he needed to.
Yeah, that was very true. I mean, but at the end of the day, to me, this game was about the fact that Washington had 0.6 yards per attempt. And, that's not completely fair because there were a lot of negative plays by the quarterbacks. But again, Jake Browning had 8 carries for negative 36 yards. I mean, they took a lot of sacks. They had a lot of negative plays. Even when they did run it, Gaskin averaged 3.4 yards per carry. And USC, like you said, that little bit of a margin, 4 yards per carry for USC, 3.4 for Washington. That little bit of a margin at the end of the day generates a total of 113 rushing for USC and 17 for Washington, just because of how much you can sustain plays and how many plays you can run as a result of that. It can completely change the complexion of a football game.
And this was a home game where, go ahead.
I was going to say one thing. Juju Smith-Schuster continues to not be the dominant receiver. Darius Rogers, as I said at the very beginning of the year, is probably the best receiver on USC's team. Yet nobody decides to acknowledge this fact.
And for those of you who don't know, it got taken down with our old channel, but we did a video to start the season because the SC was playing an Alabama team in the SEC. That Juju Smith-Schuster gets a lot of fanfare, mostly because of just coming in as a freshman, having a decent year, and then kind of building on that last year. He's got the build, he's got good straight line speed, but we talked about how he's not even the best wide receiver on his team, and definitely every big game, but almost every game this year, Darius Rogers has shown to be that guy. If I'm drafting a wide receiver off of this team and I can't draft Dory Jackson as a wide receiver, then I'm taking Darius Rogers because he's got the same size and speed, but he manages a lot more production. So we'll get that video back up on this channel now that it seems like this is our home channel. But Husky wanted to squeeze that in there, I think, for a little bit of I told y'all so, even though you didn't listen. So it was interesting for me to see Sam Darnold play this well on the road. This is the first real road game for him. But I don't know, y'all. Everybody's going to want to say that Southern Cal's a top 10 team now. They're not the same team that played Alabama. if Southern Cal played LSU tomorrow, I think LSU would be favored. And y'all think that's crazy, but I don't think they're there yet. They still have a lot of young 5-star talent. I just think they've run into a favorable schedule and a Washington team that maybe wasn't as good as we thought they were.
Yeah, and I think we're starting to question now, like we talked about with the Big Ten. I think we now have to start questioning the depth of the Pac-12. And I think there's some very good teams, but it's hard to say how much this matters. And I do think they're a completely different team, right? The fact it's mind blowing that Southern Cal lost to Stanford 27-10 at this point. It is just utterly mind blowing. But at the same time, what are we going to learn from USC when they beat a bad UCLA team and a horrible Notre Dame team to end the year? I mean, are they really a 9-3 team? I don't know. Their schedule just isn't anywhere on the same planet as what, say, LSU's faced. And I'm not just talking about the SEC schedule, right? You know, LSU played Wisconsin in a close game. Southern Cal played a juggernaut in Alabama, but was completely non-competitive. So yeah, I'm kind of with you. I'm going to be. I'm starting to be real skeptical of the Pac-12, to be honest. They have they've had a lot of rough bowl years in recent years, and I don't know why that keeps getting miscounted, but there's a lot of evidence that may not be quite as strong.
It's funny because I think you're right, especially in the bowl season. I think what we're going to see is if Washington wins out, we're really going to be able to scrutinize the Pac-12 in the context of how they fare outside of their little bubble, because I don't want to get on a rant. I'll do it for another video. But their lock-in with the Rose Bowl has insulated them a little bit from having to play big boy football outside of conference. Because if you've got the Big Ten winner going to the playoff, going to a BCS Bowl, going to the national championship game in some form or fashion, then they're putting their best against the Big Ten's next best. And as we've seen in top-heavy leagues, that might be a huge drop-off, a really big drop-off. So I kind of want Washington to win out just to see how they stack up, because I think seeing this game, Washington worried me earlier in the year as an SEC fan if they played an SEC team in the playoff, but seeing how small and how ineffective their line play was, I think Alabama for this argument because they'd be in the playoff with them, I think Alabama would kill them, where I don't think Alabama would kill everybody else.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, but it is an ill omen, right? That Southern Cal, and I wouldn't say Southern Cal, by the way, dominated this game. I mean, they did outgain Washington by a good margin, but the game was a little closer to the score. But Alabama,
only because they were falling down all over the place.
True, but Alabama beat Southern Cal 52-6. So I don't know. I think you're right. There's a lot of isolation. When the Pac-12 went to a 9-game conference schedule, that was sort of lauded. But the trick is, Pac-12 teams, despite a lot of pressure to schedule strong non-conference opponents, they've kind of failed to do so. They have a lot of tie-ins with Big 12 teams, like Texas Cal earlier in the year, but their best teams
you make a point. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but it was right on your point you're making. Who did Washington open with? Rutgers, Idaho, Portland State, and the rest are in conference.
Right. So the Pac-12, I mean, they've been some good matchups, but let's be honest, teams like Northwestern, Texas may be a big name, but they're not very good right now. Oregon sort of let off where they had some gangbuster scheduling, and you kind of have to chuckle there as an SEC fan, because why did Oregon let off? Well, because LSU beat the ever-loving brakes off them in 2011 and allowed the Alabama LSU rematch. So we don't ever get season to season. We almost never know how good the Pac-12 team is as a conference until the bowl season, because they just aren't scheduling the true top tier teams in other conferences. It's just, and when they do, unfortunately, it's like Alabama, USC, probably by far the best team in the Pac-12. And the only data point we have is that they weren't even competitive against a very good SEC team.
So, and that kind of wraps this game up. But I want to say to any butthurt Pac-12 fans, tell us in the comments how we're wrong, or send your team to the playoffs and beat somebody and give us an opportunity, because we've been high on Washington all year. So I'm perfectly happy to debate you in the comments or tell you where I think you're wrong, but give us some feedback.